Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to Ecological Psychology Seminar Series. We are really excited to kick off the fourth seminar with Julia Blau, um, presenting a very exciting talk about fractal cognition. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Julia.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on this channel. I think it's a really great idea and I'm honored to be part of it. So thank you for that. I am here today to talk about my research, which is looking at the structure of event perception and event perception generally, and particularly looking at it from using cinema as a way to investigate that. When I was in graduate school, I kept hearing these conversations about or lectures about or reading papers about event perception. And it was very interesting to me because the questions and the concepts and the talks about it actually ended up sounding an awful lot like the way that filmmakers talk about editing. And so I got interested in that because I thought, that can't be a coincidence, right? There's probably a reason why these two things are linked. And at this point, have at least convinced myself that it's not a coincidence. There is a reason for it because films are what they are. They work when they take advantage of perceptual systems, when they actually mimic the information that we detect on a daily basis. That's when films actually work for us and do a good job. So I started investigating event perception through that lens, if you'll pardon the pun. But when I started looking at the literature and really digging into it, and I should be honest here, I'm mostly talking about stuff that is not ecological, but most of it treated time a little bit like the panels in this cartoon. So time sort of moves inexorably forward and it gets broken down into chunks of a particular size. And the size of those chunks is very much dependent on the experiment itself. So if the experiment is 5 minutes long, the time chunks are going to be smaller. If the experiment is a couple of hours long, the time chunks are going to be bigger. But when you treat time like that or time perception like that, it requires you to decide in advance what scale of event that you're going to be paying attention to. And most of the research proceeded like that. It was looking at, how many events a person would parse something into, but then they would limit them to, okay, well, we're just going to do it in this one window. So it required them to know what scale to pay attention to begin with. And the problem there is that for any given phenomenon, there's going to be events at all scales of measurement that might be important. So one of the issues that I talk about and we'll talk about in this talk is the issue of anxiety, right? So if you've got someone, this is Fred, by the way, if anybody doesn't know my Fred yet, this is Fred. And if you've got someone like Fred and he's going to be developing emotions, what makes him develop emotions that are calm, cool, collected versus stressed out, anxious? And there's a lot of answers to this. You go to the literature on anxiety and there's a ton of research on any time scale you can imagine. So they talk about anxiety being something that's in your DNA, right? They've bred anxious mice. So changes in DNA is an event that has a very long time scale, especially if we're talking about humans and not mice. This hundreds of years to change that kind of thing. So that event is very long. But then there are also studies where they manipulate the perceived heart rate of the participant and induce a feeling of anxiety because the participant thinks their heart is racing. So this is a very short time scale. We have something where it's changing on the order of a couple of seconds instead of generations. And the truth is that there is everything across this whole spectrum. If you're a researcher and you're interested in anxiety, you're interested in studying Fred and figuring out whether or not he's going to be anxious, you can do things like look at DNA. You can do things that look like heart rate, but you could also look at how he was parented and what his relationship with his parents was. You could look at triggers and life events, like is he participating in something anxiety producing, like giving a talk on the internet, for example, or any number of other events at various different time scales, all of which might impact Fred in this moment, right? How anxious he feels in this moment. So if you're going to do event perception research, trying to decide ahead of time which scale matters might be problematic because they kind of all matter. So the problem there is that it's still treating time like it's breaking it up into these chunks. And when you start digging into the ecological research, the suggestion there is that we shouldn't be understanding time in that way, that we should be talking about events rather than time perception as such. And events are nested. So here's what we mean by that. Let's say that there's this event of me giving this talk right now, right? That is an event that we are all experiencing. But then in that event, there's going to be shorter events. So there was the event of me making that self-depreciating joke earlier. And then there's this event right now of me explaining this. And then later there's going to be an event where I describe detrended fluctuation analysis and scare off all the people who don't like math. And all of those are going to be nested in. They're going to be subordinate events to the event giving a talk. But then giving a talk is itself nested within other events, right, that are longer than itself. So me giving this talk is part of my career as a scientist. It's also part of my day, right? So these longer events that are superordinate to the event giving a talk, that it is nested within. That nesting across scales tells us that we should be looking at a different type of analysis than those sort of static analyses that the counting of events does. And we can take advantage of something here, which is that there is a rough self-similarity across scales. So these events aren't exactly the same at different scales, but they have similar qualities across the scales. All of them are nested, all of them are nested within something else, all of them have events nested within them. There's change that defines boundaries. So there's some self-similarity across those scales. Given that, one of the ways to investigate that kind of structure is using fractality. So for the layperson, when you think about fractality, if you think about it at all, which is probably not a lot, you might think of these beautiful pictures of fractal paintings, and those are gorgeous, don't get me wrong, I love them. But that isn't sort of all they can do. We can use fractal analyses in cases like this to help us with the problems we've been describing. So to first explain, what is a fractal? Most fractals, the way they work is you start with a shape, which is called the seed, and then you do something to that shape, which is called an iteration, and then you do the same thing again, and then you do the same thing again, and then you do the same thing again for infinity. So let me give you an example, which is the Koch snowflake. The seed for the Koch snowflake is an equilateral triangle. So you start with that. Then you take out the middle third of each side, and you put in another equilateral triangle. And that's the first iteration. And then you take out the middle third of each of those sides and put in an equilateral triangle. So that's the second iteration. And then you take out the middle third of those sides and you put in an equilateral triangle, right? So each one of those iterations adds more and more and more triangles. For the true Koch snowflake, you'd have to do this forever, but we don't have that kind of time. So I'm going to stop there. But our Koch snowflake is a fractal. It has all of these different and interesting patterns to it. And there's a lot of really interesting things about fractals, but we don't have time to go into all of those. So I'm just going to go into the thing that is sort of the most important for this talk, which is to talk about what happens when you zoom in. So here we have our Koch snowflake with all the little triangles. If we take one area of it and we zoom in on that area, what we realize is that by zooming in, we've revealed finer features, right? There are smaller triangles and smaller triangles and smaller triangles. And we can do it again. We can zoom in on one area of it. And again, we find smaller triangles and smaller triangles and smaller triangles. But not just any triangles. They're exactly the same as the ones at the other level, right? What we have here is, again, that self-similarity across scales. So this is how this is going to be helpful to our study of events, is we're going to be able to take advantage of the fact that fractals are used to handling things that are self-similar across scales. But when we're looking at something like the Koch snowflake, the similarity is exact. Those are the exact same triangles. That is the exact same pattern. If I zoomed in again, you'd get the exact same pattern again, because we're in the realm right now of mathematical fractals, where things are exactly the same. And I mentioned about events, that's not really going to fly because the events aren't exactly the same across, just kind of the same across scales. So if we're going to do that, we have to do something a little different. If we want to address our self-similarity of events, we're going to need to go into the realm of natural fractals. And these are shapes where they still exhibit that self-similarity across scales, but the self-similarity is a much more roughly defined type. So take, for example, the coastline of Italy, which is basically a wiggly line. Really, any coastline is going to be just basically a wiggly line. So if you zoom in on one part of that coastline and you blow it up, you reveal finer features, and it's basically a wiggly line. So we'll do it again. You can zoom in on one part of it and it reveals finer features, and you have basically a wiggly line. And you can do that forever. You can go all the way down until we're zooming in on a grain of sand, the edge of which is basically a wiggly line. So we see that wiggly lineness at all of the different scales of measurement. What that means is that there's no characteristic scale. There's no one scale that actually shows you what the thing is like. Or put it another way, all of the scales show us what the coastline of Italy is like. So you don't have to measure the whole thing. You don't have to measure all of those levels. You can measure one level, look at the dynamics at one level, and understand something about all of the other levels. Right? So this is the promise of fractal structure or fractal analyses, is it's going to allow us to do scale independent investigation. It won't matter that we're only looking at this one time scale, because it's going to tell us something about all of the other time scales. So I started researching this, and in the experiments that I'm going to present today, I'm going to be presenting essentially two different types of dependent variables. So there's two things that I'm going to measure. One is looking at the edit points in films. So if you're watching a movie, next time you're watching a movie, and there's a scene happening between two people, say, most of the time the scene starts off with a shot of the two of them in the frame, not usually as far away as this one shows, but a shot of the two of them in the frame. And then at some point it will cut to a shot over one of the people's shoulder at the other. And then at some point it will cut and get the reverse, where you're over the shoulder of the other character. Right? So those moments where we transition from one viewpoint to a different viewpoint are called edit points. So that's one of the things that I looked at. The other thing I looked at were participant taps. So I brought participants to a variety of scenarios, which I'll talk about, and I gave them a button box. It's a little plastic box, and it has a little lever on it, and then a wire which goes into a recorder. And they can push the lever, and when they do, it sends a beep through that wire that gets recorded by the thing, and then I've got a computer program that picks them out. But basically, I can figure out the timing of when people are pushing that button. So I can bring them and have them mark the events somewhere, for example. Either way, regardless of which of these we are talking about, I'm going to do the same analysis on them. So to understand that, we have to first graph the data that we get. So let's imagine we had an event point or an edit point. Then a certain amount of time will pass, and then there will be another edit point. And then a certain amount of time will pass, and there'll be another edit point. And then a certain amount of time will pass, and we'll have another edit point, and so on and so on. So what I'm looking at here are the inter-edit intervals. We could do the same thing for the taps, right? There's a tap, a certain amount of time passes, another tap, so on and so on. So we can look at the inter-tap intervals. So if we take those and we graph them, the number of taps over time and the interval over time, what we get is essentially a wiggly line, right? So this graph, this wiggly line, we are going to put through our analysis. That analysis is called detrended fluctuation analysis, which we often abbreviate DFA, I think, so that we don't scare off the people who don't like math. So if you don't like math, you can take a little break, maybe fast forward if you're watching this on the time delay. But just as like a quick primer for what DFA does, is it takes this wiggly line and it's going to treat this wiggly line the same way that we did the coastline of Italy, right? Mathematically speaking, what we did on the coastline was we zoomed in and it revealed finer features, and we zoomed in and it revealed finer features. So we're going to try and do the same thing with this time series. We're going to zoom in and see, does it reveal finer features when we do that? So the first step is to detrend the data. And what this does is if the data gets longer and longer over time, or gets shorter and shorter over time, it can overwhelm the analysis. So I, for example, did a study where I was looking at boxers and how often they punched. And it turned out that the longer the match went on, the delay between punches got longer and longer and longer. So that would be an example of a trended time series. That is not, you got to detrend that before we do the analysis, because otherwise it would just have totally overwhelmed it. It's like you have fractality when you don't. So we detrend it first. Then you cut the data series in half into two of what we call bins. And then in each bin, you put in a best fit line. Now, best fit lines are not going to be perfect at this point, obviously, but the question is not, are they perfect? The question is, how off are they? How much error is there? Because the error gives us gives us an idea of how much fluctuation or how many tiny features we're looking at here. So we put the best fit line in and we get our error term, which is the average root mean square for those that care. All right, so we dropped in, we did our best fit line. Then we're going to cut it up again into 4 bins now. Once again, best fit line. Once again, we're looking at the average root mean square, which is the deviation away from the line. Then we'll do it again. We cut it in half again and we get more best fit lines, and we look at the deviation there. And we'll keep doing this. You keep cutting it in half and in half and in half until you get to 2 points in a bin, because 2 points define a line. So the root mean square will get down to 0 at that point. Once the bin gets small enough, you're going to have no error. So it's not a question of whether or not you eventually get to the point where that line perfectly captures it, because you will, because it's a finite time series. The question is, how fast does it go down? If something is fractal, then as you zoom in, which is what we're doing by looking at smaller and smaller pieces of it, as you zoom in, there should be an increasing amount of error, or rather not an increasing amount of error, but you should still find error. That error should stay in those bins. Eventually it's going to go to 0, but we wonder how fast. So after all of that, what you do is you graph the average root mean square, that error term, by the size of the bin. And we do this in log-log coordinates because then we get a straight line. And the slope of that line is called the Hurst exponent, which I'll write H for the rest of this. H, or a Hurst exponent, if it is between 0.5 and 1, then our time series is fractal. It is specifically fractal and persistent, for those who care. The bottom end of this range, the 0.5 end, things are more random. And the top end of this range, the 1 end of this range, things have a lot more structure. So changes can happen within that range. And that's where we're going to be playing, right? Is in that range. It's a very broad range, and things can happen that sort of move it around in that range. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in these studies is how much does it move around and what happens when you move it around. So my research basically has 2 main questions or 2 main goals as I've gone over the years in doing this research. The first goal, first and foremost, was to show that real life events and real cinematic events, it's a good pun. I like this pun very much. I use it every time. That these 2 events have something in common, that the perceptual experience while watching them is at least similar enough that we can use film as a way to kind of poke at the perceptual system and understand it scientifically. And if it's the case that there's enough commonalities between those, then you can use films. And the thing that's great about films is that they're tractable, right? You can go in and change the event and change the order of events and change the way that the event's structured in a way that you cannot do in real life, right? You can't go to a field and make the wind blow differently, but you could do it in a film. You can change those things in that space. And so if we can say that watching a film is enough like watching real life, then we can use films to investigate human perception. I also am interested in, okay, then what, right? If we're using it to investigate human perception, what do we find? As we change the structure, as we change that event structure, what are the consequences for the person? And if the person changes, does that change the way that they view those events? In particular, my research is focused in 3 areas. I've looked at the effect it has had on anxiety. I have looked at the effect it has on memory. And I have looked at the way that this changes our appraisal of films themselves, right? So aesthetically, do we find them more interesting or more pleasing when we have certain kinds of fractality? So that's what the rest of this talk is going to focus on, is research in those 3 main areas. So first and foremost, I had to say, okay, yes, this works, right? We can use fractals for this. So my first pass was to bring a bunch of participants to several natural environments, differing in activity level mainly. So we brought them to a field with some trees, and the events were like wind, and possibly there was like an anthill near one. I brought them to a Bookworms Cafe, which is the coffee shop at UConn campus. And I brought them to a busy intersection as classes were changing. So there was like a lot of people going on. I had them sit there for 120 minutes, which, in case you're wondering, is a very long time to ask an undergrad to sit still and do something for you. But I did that. And I gave them tapper boxes, and I asked them to hit the button every time they saw something change in whatever they were paying attention to, which is a definition of events that is like a very Gibsonian-based definition of events. So I did that, right? I had participants come and do this. And what I found was that regardless of the activity level of the area, the Hurst of the taps was fractal and was roughly the same. It was all in this 0.6 category. And they tapped thousands of times. This is the average number of taps, but it's worth noting that participants tapped all over the place. There were some with 5,000 taps and some with like a couple hundred. So it was all over the place with the number of events that they saw, but the fractality remained roughly the same for all of the participants. So then I was like, all right, so this is going to kind of work. We can use fractality for looking at events. So let's try with cinematic events. That was for natural events. Let's bring them in and have them look at movies. So I brought them into my lab, and by my lab, I mean my living room, where I had a TV, and, you know, I gave them a button box and I asked them to do the same task, right? Watch the movie and then tap the button anytime something changes in whatever it is you're paying attention to. And I had the participants watch 4 movies. I had them watch Pride and Prejudice, the Keira Knightley version. It's like 2005. Yeah. Starship Troopers, which just gets worse every time you watch it, by the way, in case you're wondering about that. 27 Dresses, which also declines upon rewatch, and Bad Boys, which just gets funnier every single time you see it. This is my film judgment by Julia. At any rate, there were 4 films. Everybody watched all 4 films, and this represents 2 films that have, I looked at their edit points, and 2 of these films have a relatively low Hurst in their editing, and 2 of the films have a relatively high Hurst in their editing. And then I compared the response Hurst, so their tapping Hurst, to the edit Hurst of the film. And I found that there was a relationship. So when the edit Hurst of the film was low, the tapping Hurst was low. When the edit Hurst of the film was high, the tapping Hurst was high. And that was true for every participant, right? So it wasn't just averaged across. For every participant, this was the case. Their own tapping mimicked the editing Hurst of the movie itself. Now, one way you could do that would be pretty boring is if you tapped to the edit points, which you can do, right? Especially if you know enough about films to recognize the edit points when they're happening. That'd be one pretty boring way of replicating the edit Hurst. So I looked at that, and this is for one of the participants. Their taps by the laid over on top of the edit for that film. So you can see in blue all of the edit structures, and then in red, their taps. If they were tapping to the edit points, you would expect the number of taps and the number of edits to be roughly the same, and they are not. And you would expect these graphs to kind of line up with each other, and they do not. But the hearse are pretty much the same. So they're both, the editing of the film and the perceiver of the film are kind of paying attention to something else. They are looking at the structure of the events in the movie and both finding ways to sort of mark those events. At least that's the way that I interpret that. So around the same time I was doing this, Cutting DeLong and Nulfer put out a study where they looked at the editing in different genres of film. And they were doing it with a different fractal analysis. They weren't doing DFA, but you can take what they did and convert it so that you can look at the hearse, and it's roughly the same. And what they saw was that there are some genres that have higher hearse in the editing and some genres that have lower hearse in the editing. Specifically, action films have the highest, followed by adventure films, then animation, then comedy, and with the lowest, we have drama. And I read this and I thought it was very interesting as a study, but also genre is like one of the worst ways to talk about film, because genre is at best fuzzy boundaries, right? It's rare that you have a film that's just one thing. It's going to be action and comedy. It's going to be drama and romance, right? It's going to be a lot of different things. So being able to categorize something as just one genre isn't going to be easy. And I looked at this list and I wondered if maybe it wasn't the genre per se, but the feeling that those movies invoke, right? The way that they make you feel when you're watching them. And I saw that these top ones, right? Action and adventure, these are the kind of movies that induce a feeling of anxiety, right? When you're watching them, you're on the edge of your seat, you're nervous, you're worried for the hero. And that was what I was wondering. Maybe it's not about the genre, which is like a fuzzy category, but anxiety, which is a more cognitively based variable. So I wanted to see whether or not anxiety and higher hearse were related. First, I did this by looking at naturally anxiogenic events. So these are events that caused anxiety. Now, the problem there, of course, is that real life events that cause anxiety, it's not really ethical to bring participants to, like, hey, let's go watch a car crash, right? Like it's like not super ethical to do that. So I wanted an event that I knew would cause anxiety, but that would not be a problem to bring people to. So it chose basketball. And I brought a group of 5 sports fans, specifically basketball sport fans, and 5 non-sports fans. They all had to complete a basketball IQ test. And just as you would expect, the sports fans did much better than the non-sports fans. And I had them rate their anxiety, I had them tap to the events of the game, right? They get a little tapper box and they tapped to whenever there was a change in whatever they were paying attention to. And I also had them rate their anxiety. So I had them rate their anxiety before the game started. And then I had them at the midway point, I had them rate their anxiety, how they were feeling during the first half. And after the game was over, I had them rate their anxiety, how they were feeling during the second half. What I was interested in was, is there a relationship between the tapping hearse and the amount of anxiety that they were feeling? Because if my hypothesis about the movies is right, then there should be possibly a connection between those. And what I found was that regardless of whether or not the person was a sports fan or not a sports fan, their anxiety and their tapping hearse were related. So the higher the anxiety, the higher the tapping hearse was. Interestingly, our non-sports fans were on average more anxious than our sports fans while watching the game. And I think that has to do with the fact that at some point the game became a blowout. And so the actual sports fans were like, oh, phew, I don't have to worry about this anymore. But our non-sports fans didn't know. So they were still on the edge of their seat. But anyway, regardless, the amount of anxiety that they showed and the amount of anxiety they were feeling changed the way that they perceived those events. So the higher the anxiety, the higher their TAT. So, all right, so there's some evidence there that the Hearst and the anxiety are linked, but action and adventure films also have something else in common, which is that the imagery in them itself is anxiety producing, right? Over and above any presentation, just the images themselves are going to be a source of anxiety. So these are called high arousal images, right? So it's got like explosions and naked ladies, right? All of this stuff is going to make your heart rate go up. So they also have this. So I wanted to tease apart what is the influence of the Hearst and what is the influence of the imagery. To do that, I put together slideshows. I got a whole bunch of images from the IAPS database. So that stands for International Affective Picture System. And what they have are thousands of images that have been looked at and rated by a lot of participants. And so on a number of different scales, one of which is this arousal thing, right? So how exciting is the image, basically, either positively or negatively. And I got a bunch of these that were the lowest interest photographs, which had a lot of office supplies, so fans, pencils, filing cabinets, and for some reason, a lot of mushrooms, like enough mushrooms that a few participants were like, "Does this study have something to do with mushrooms?" So I would use fewer mushrooms next time. But these were the least exciting of the photographs, and then I went through and found the most exciting photographs that were not also traumatic to look at, because some of the photos in that database are very upsetting and can't be unseen. So so not those, but the next most anxiety producing images, right? Explosion, or not anxiety so much as arousal. So explosions, naked ladies, puppies, exciting stuff. So I have a set of uninteresting photographs and I have a set of very interesting photographs, right? Low arousal and high arousal. I then changed the amount of time that those photos lingered on the screen in my slideshow so that one set of them had a low Hearst and the other set of them had a high Hearst. So 4 different slideshows. I then gave them to different groups to watch. And after they watched the video, I would ask them to rate their anxiety. And it gave me a number on a scale of 1 to 10. So first and foremost, the arousal of the images, as predicted, had a strong effect on how anxious people felt after watching them. There was a fairly low amount of anxiety after looking at a bunch of mushrooms and a much higher amount after looking at explosions. That's to be expected. But there was also a main effect of the Hearst of presentation, such that the higher Hearst slideshows, those people felt more anxiety while watching them. And that difference is mostly carried in this interaction. So for the low arousal photographs, there is a small difference. It is there. But for the high arousal photographs, also having the higher Hearst increased the anxiety even more. And that tall green bar, that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the action movies and the adventure movies, is we're talking about high arousal imagery that has been presented in that high Hearst format, right, with that structure. So it's inducing the strongest amount of anxiety in the audience. So I did all of this research in the anxiety, and I was similarly interested in other cognitive effects. So I also turned my attention to looking at memory. So Ebbinghaus was one of the first people to really start investigating memory. And one of the very first studies that he did is he brought participants into a lab and he gave them lists of nonsense words to memorize. And they could stay there and memorize it for as long as they wanted. And then he would bring them back a day later and figure out how much of them they still remembered. And then he'd have them start over again with a new set of words. And then he'd have them come back 2 days later and see how much they remembered. And then he'd have them start all over again with another set of words and have them come back 3 days later and then do it all over again for 4 days later and all over again for 5 and then 10 and so on, right? All the way out until 30 days later, right? So the important part here is that they learn it And then there's a gap during which they don't practice that information. They never hear or see that information before the test. And what we see is that the percent retained, or the amount that they remember, has this very specific curve where it drops off very quickly in the beginning, but then there's this sort of slow fade out over time. That curve happens over and over and over again in memory research. Anytime you're looking at somebody looking for decay of memory, so forgetting, you see that curve over and over and over and over again, not just by Ebbinghaus, but by many, 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 many people. So you have this sort of characteristic forgetting curve. And the question there is like, why? Why would our memories have that exact same curve every single time for forgetting? Why does it always look like that? Anderson and Schuler in 91 did a great study where they looked at why that might be. And their argument, which is a very Gibsonian argument, is you can't really understand the organism without understanding the environment. These things are one thing, and so if you want to understand it, you have to look at all of it. And they suggested that the reason our memory is what it is because our environment is what it is. So they looked at that curve. They also converted it to log-log coordinates because it makes a straight line, and those are easier to compare, frankly. And they looked at their own email inboxes, so from whom they are getting messages. They looked at headlines in newspapers, and they looked at parental speech. So this was from a database of, I'm actually not really sure. It was parents talking to children, and I'm not sure why they were allowed to audio that, but they did. And so they were able to look at the utterances parents spoke to their children over a long course of time. And what they looked at was for any given piece of information. So for example, in the email inboxes, they're looking at who has sent the message, right? So that's a piece of information is who sent the message. For the headlines, they were looking at what is the news item? Is this going to be an item about Qatar? Is this going to be an item? I can't think of any other news item right now, but some particular news item. And then they ask, okay, say that person sent me an email and I'm on day 10, having not heard from them in 10 days. What are the chances that I will hear from them on day 11? Right, so this is what they're calculating, is that the time since the last time since you were presented with that piece of information, what is the chance you're going to need that information tomorrow? So essentially what they're asking is, over time, if the thing hasn't been presented to you, what is the likelihood you're going to need it? What is the likelihood that you will need that memory of that person, of that news event, of the topic your mom's talking to you about? And what they found was that the need for the memory precisely mimicked that forgetting curve, right? Or put it another way, their suggestion was our memory decay is what it is because the need for the memory decays at exactly the same rate, right, in real life. Now, they didn't actually do a causal study, right? They're just looking at the environment as it exists and doing the math on that. To do a causal study, what you would need to do is present the information at different structures with different needs odds, right? Different likelihood of it being needed, and then measure the memory for it, which is tough to do because you have to have like a lot of control over a person's life if you want to do it at the scale that they were looking at, like emails and newspaper clippings. But once again, because we're doing fractals, we can manipulate things in a very short time window and understand something about longer time windows. So in this study, I took films and manipulated the fractality of the presentation to see if that would alter the decay of memory for that presentation. Right, so here we're talking about a film. What is their memory for that film over time? My sun has shifted here and you can't really see me anymore. All right. So I took a movie called Sophie, and this is a study that I started when I was a professor at SUNY Purchase, which is a fairly well-known film school. And this film was the winner of the student award for that year. So this was the best made film by a student for whatever year this was. I don't remember, 2012 maybe. And I took that film and I cut it up on its edit points, right? I marked out its edit points and found that it had an edit Hurst of 0.84. Right, so it's relatively high edit Hurst. I then took that edit sequence. So I've got the inter-edit intervals in an Excel document, and I randomized them in the Excel document. And then I ran the DFA again, and then I randomized them and I ran the DFA again, and then I randomized them and I ran the DFA again. And I just did this like a lot. I think I did it a couple hundred times until I found time series that had the structure that I was looking for. Specifically, I was looking for 0.7, 0.65, and 0.5. All right, so those are the three that I ended up with. And I'll explain why those three later when I show you some data, but that's what I chose. So it's important to remember that these new Excel spreadsheet has exactly the same edit points as the original. So it's all this, it'll all add up to exactly the same thing. It'll have the same number of edits and so on. And then took those, actually got an actual editor, a real editor person, to take those time series and alter the film to match those time series. So the sequence of shots is the same. So we're still going to start with the 2-shot and then over the shoulder. But we're going to take the new timing from the Excel spreadsheet and cut it at that time instead. So the first shot in the original movie might be 5.6 seconds, but now I'm going to stop it after 2.1 seconds and go to the over the shoulder shot sooner in the narrative, right? And that one only lasts for 1 second, and then I go to the third one, right? So the same sequence of images, but just they're lingering on the screen for a different amount of time. By doing this, these 4 films have the exact same sequence of events. They have the exact same length of movie, the exact same number of edits, the same mean and standard deviation of edit length, and importantly, the same edit density. I mention that because edit density is one of those things that filmmakers talk about a lot as being the potential reason why action films are more anxiogenic than a romance, is because there are more edits per minute, which is sort of true, but not actually as true as you would think. So the edit density really doesn't change that much across the movies, but what does change is that editing Hurst. And here, the edit density doesn't change at all. It is identical for the 4 because it is the same exact number of edits. I showed those videos to groups of people, right? So 4 different groups of people watched these films. And I measured everybody directly after the film. The people who came, half of those people I had come back 1 week later and take a follow-up quiz. And then the other half of the people I had come back 2 weeks later and take a follow-up quiz. Because you have to have that delay, right? And you have to not practiced it in the middle. So I can't have the same people come back 1 week later and then 2 weeks later, because the test itself becomes practicing that material. So I had to do it this way. So I did that for all 4 movies, which then leaves me with some really weird data because it's not a fully within subjects design, and it is not technically a between subjects design. And you can do what's called a match subjects design, where you match them at time 1, and then you pretend that they're the same person for time 2 and time 3. But when I did that, it turned out that so many people did not come back later that I ended up throwing away like half the data, and I didn't like throwing away data. So that seemed messy and honestly not a very conservative way to look at our data. So what I did was I just analyzed it as if it was a between subjects design. That actually ends up being a more conservative way to look at these things. So that's what I did. When I gave them their quizzes, I measured a couple of things. One was event memory. So here I'm asking them questions about things that happened in the film, right? It was a multiple choice quiz with various different answers. And so it was for events or things that happened in the film. The second was image memory. And this is a classic way of trying to see whether or not people remember images, is to present it both in its original orientation and then present it in 180-degree flipped orientation and ask them which orientation is original from the film. So if you look at those decay for those different types of memory over time, in the event memory, we don't see an effect of the movie. Regardless of the movie, regardless of the editing Hearst, they still show that characteristic Ebbinghaus curve, right? Exactly the same. But for image memory, that is not the case. For image memory, there is a significant time by edit interaction such that the decay of memory over time changes depending on which editing Hearst we are talking about here. Right? So it's sort of a strange thing, right? That the event memory, right, for the content of the events, that still shows that Ebbinghausian curve. But the image memory, which is the thing we were ultimately altering, ultimately altering, was the presentation of the images. That is the thing that actually did change in its decay over time. Also part of that survey, I asked them to rate the aesthetics of the film. So I asked them a ton of questions, things like, what is the production value of the film? And was it well shot? Is the lighting good? Is the framing good? So questions that would be asked when you were showing a film and for like a festival and trying to see which one should win. These would be the kind of questions you asked for that aesthetic appraisal. And that gives you a score of 1 to 7 for how much people enjoyed the film. And what I found was that, interestingly, there is an effective Hearst such that the 0.65 version and the 0.84 version are very well liked, or more well liked anyway, than the 0.5 and the 0.79, which is actually what I was expecting, because while cutting found editing Hearsts all over the map, when I go and cut up professional films, most of the time I find that the editing Hearsts are either around 0.84 or around 0.65. Those are the two numbers that come up over and over again, is those two. So I've sort of dubbed those the sweet spots. And what we have here is the two sweet spot movies are doing significantly better than the two non-sweet spot movies, which is why I chose the Hearst that I did, right, to try and get at that question. What's also interesting to me, and this is just sort of as an aside, is that their liking of the movie decreased significantly over time. So it's like as it faded in their memory, they were like, oh yeah, maybe that movie sucked. I don't know. Like, that's just sort of an aside, but kind of interesting. What I was looking at here, though, and sort of something to remember, is that in those neutral, natural events, this is, bringing them to the cafe and bringing them to the field. For that neutral events, we see that 0.64 is that the average of that tapping. When I brought people to the basketball game, a natural anxiogenic event, they tapped at about 0.8. So here we have those same numbers that we find and in the editing as those sweet spot numbers. It's also worth noting that the 0.84 was also the original, and editing is what it is for a reason. Editors are putting the edit points where they want them. So it also makes sense that that would be the best liked film because it was the one that was made the way the filmmaker intended. So there's a bit of a conflation there. But also, it is that natural anxiogenic number. And again, when I look at films, I tend to find that our action adventure films have an edit Hearst of about 0.8, and the romance and dramas tend to have an edit Hearst of about 0.64. So more and more I've become obsessed with this idea that filmmaking is what it is. It is good. It works when it effectively mimics what we do in real life, right? It is effectively standing in for the environment. And so it has to do that well. So my thought was, maybe the people who are good editors are replicating natural event perception. So to do that, you have to figure out, what are good editors doing? So I compared amateur films, really, really bad amateur films, to really, really good professionally made films, right? Hollywood films. So the Hollywood films were gathered from lists of like the 50 best movies of all time, 100 movies you have to see before you die, right? Those kind of superlative lists. I culled them down to see what movies appeared on all of the lists. And then I chose the ones of those that either won or were nominated for best editing in their year. And then to narrow it down, I just kind of went around to people and said, hey, which of these is your favorite? Right? And the ones that people voted for the most got narrowed down to be the ones that I ended up using. And then also got some amateur films. And these are really, really bad things that you only find if you know just the right corners of the internet to go looking for. Like, this is not a thing you're going to find in your local movie store. I guess those don't even exist anymore either. But you're not going these are made by students. These are made by, people who don't know what they're doing. And those of them that had an IMDb page, which not all of them did, but those of them that did had a lot of low ratings on there. And then the ones that were on YouTube all had more dislikes than likes, right? So these are films that are bad films. That was the goal. And I had 15 of each, and I cut them up on their edit points to see what their editing Hearst was. And I had two not mutually exclusive hypotheses. One is that the edit Hearst on average would just be different for the amateur films than for the professionally made films, right? That the average editing would just be different. My second hypothesis would be that the average might be the same, but that the standard deviation would be different, right? Or put it another way, they're both aiming at the same target, but the professionals are good at hitting it, right? So their films are going to be very tightly clustered around it, where the amateurs are going to be all over the place. And it's this second hypothesis that was supported by the data, right? Sure enough, the average was about the same, 0.65 again. And the standard deviation, and that is not significantly different from each other, obviously, but the standard deviation for the professionally made films was 0.05, where the standard deviation for our amateur films was 0.11. And Levian's test for heteroskedasticity shows that those are significantly different. So the standard deviation is significantly higher for our amateur films. Which led me to the question of, how do you become a professional filmmaker then? Like, how do you get from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen? How do you go from making them like crappy films in your backyard to making good films professionally with like millions of dollars? And again, I have two not mutually exclusive hypotheses. One is that it's learning. So people who start off all over the place over time manage to converge on that sweet spot of 0.65 or the other sweet spot of 0.8. Or only the people who can hit the target get to keep making films. So the ones who don't hit the target become like investment bankers or something, right? They go become college professors instead. And the ones that can hit the sweet spot are the ones who go on to make those professional films. So to test this, I'm starting to look at individual careers. I wanted to look at one person on their journey from being an amateur filmmaker to a Hollywood filmmaker, right? Looking at least 10 movies across the course of that career. And you need to have someone who becomes sufficiently famous that their like college work becomes commercially available because they have like a cult following that wants to go look at that stuff. So again, we're looking at edit points, and I chose for the first round of this, George Lucas, because he's sort of known for having a lot of obsessive control over his films and also has a cult following. And so his college movies are available for purchase. And what I found was that if you graph the Hearst of those movies over the release date, you actually do see a change over time. But it's interesting because he actually starts around the first sweet spot, about 0.6, and slowly but surely makes his way up to the other sweet spot, right, which is at about 0.85. So it doesn't really help me with my original question, but it is interesting because George Lucas never made a romance. He doesn't make dramas. He doesn't make those things that should be at 0.65. He entirely makes action films, right? Specifically sci-fi action films, all of them, every single one of these movies. And so his target might not be 0.65 or 0.64. His target might be one of those higher Hursts. And so what we're seeing is sort of a gradual getting there over time. In general, I wondered about this too, not just with filmmakers who are sort of professional event markers, but with people, because not that editors aren't people, but they're specific people with a very specific job, right? Your average person isn't sitting around marking events all of the time. So the question was, is this something that anybody can do? Do we attune to event structures over time? And to test this, I looked at children's films, because children's films have a different event structure than ones that are made for adults. So the adult ones tend to be 0.6 or 0.8 and really nothing in between, whereas children's films tend to be about 0.7-ish, right? So it's somewhere in between those two numbers. I gathered participants who in particular do not watch children's films, and in particular hadn't watched these 6 children's films. And I had them come in and watch the movies in a random order. And I had them tap to the events in that film. And I compared their tapping Hearst to the edit Hearst of the film. So for each participant, for each movie, I computed what I call HDiff. So the difference between their tapping Hearst and the edit Hearst of the film. If, in fact, people attune to this structure over time, then we would expect that the error would decrease over time. We expect HDiff to decrease. And in fact, that is exactly what we see. This is a specific experiment, or excuse me, a specific participant and their HDiff decreasing over time, but they all look like this. This is just one example, right? All of them get closer and closer to the edit Hearst of the film over time. And I find this particularly interesting because if this didn't matter, if the fractal structure of the events didn't matter, then they wouldn't be attuning to it. They wouldn't get closer and closer to it. It has to be something that they are actively paying attention to in order for them to get closer and closer to it. And even though they may not know about fractals and they may not know about any of that stuff, they're able to pay attention to the structure of the events in the film and get better and better at paying attention to the structure of the events, even if they don't know any of the math behind it. So this is sort of where I am at this point. I have, I hope, documented enough of the commonalities between real and real events that we can really look at films and using films as a way to poke at the event perception of people. Again, films have such a tractable event structure. We can manipulate them in so many different ways. So having them be a good in for that would be useful. And then I'm looking at some of the cognitive consequences for varying temporal structure. I think there are a lot more out there that people could or should be interested in. But in particular, I am interested in the way that this affects anxiety. I sort of almost think that this might be a way to decrease anxiety. So it's like, maybe someday I'll get into that. I think it could be a way to help increase memory retention over time. We saw that the presentation of the images, at least, did change the recall for those images. I wonder if we change the presentation of the events themselves, if that would also change the memory for the events. I don't know. I think it's worth looking into. And aesthetic appraisal. So this is one of those, if I could just get the filmmakers to sit still long enough, I feel like I could let them know that we can track this. We can find out what the editing Hearst of your movies is and show you that people will like it more if it more closely approximates human perception. So that is what I have. Any questions out there?
Okay, wow. Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic. That was amazing. Let me just have a look. See. Okay, so if you are watching in the chat,
I'm not. I didn't even have it open. You're gonna have to tell me.
Let's see. If you are watching live, sorry, you can put a question in the chat. but I will actually steal the first question as I've kind of been doing.
That's fine.
Um, have you sort of made contact with the film industry, and what's
No,
their
I
response
tried.
been?
So the thing about artists is they don't love it when you try and science their art. And I respect that. I do. And so I have gotten one of three responses when I've tried to talk to filmmakers about this. One is just like outright anger and defensiveness, and you can't science my art and go away. And one is like the condescending, oh, that's nice. And then they walk away. And then I've had like one or two of them be completely fascinated by this idea and sit down and try and pick it apart. But it's also one of those that's sort of hard to put into practice if you don't have the analysis tools to test the fractality of your own films. Putting it into practice is not necessarily easy. So while I do think it is good and would be helpful, they're going to need to like bring in a mathematician to do the math on the editing to actually apply it. But I think the most enthusiastic response I got was when I was working at SUNY Purchase, and I taught a class there called Psychology of Film, and I had a bunch of the film kids come take that class, and they loved it. Because we didn't just talk about this, we also talked about Anderson put out a book a while back on the ecological approach to film, and it's just fantastic. And it talks about a lot of the other ways in which film mimics our perception or the information that we detect on the daily, because it has to in order to work, right? Our perceptual system isn't different when we watch movies, it's still the same thing. So that also has a lot of that stuff in it. And those students were thrilled. The students were all about it and ready to go change the way they make films and incorporate it immediately. You know, the established filmmakers less interested. So
Interesting. So let me ask you this then, because I forget what it's called, something's law, that if a metric becomes a target, sometimes it sort of loses value or something like that. So what do you think would happen if you say were an editor and you did buy into this and you did like really intentionally try to hit those sweet spots?
So I don't know about it in editing because I've never tried it in editing, but I will say that I have tried to reproduce these structures with no input, right? Because I was wondering if it's a demand characteristic, right? Is it something that I can sit down and just decide I'm going to give you a high Hearst and then give you a high Hearst? Can I sit down and decide to give you a random one and give you a random one? And it turns out no, you cannot do that. There is no relationship between what you were aiming for, or at least when I did it, and I had my then boyfriend, now husband, do it, and neither one of us, it was like there was no relationship between what it was that we were trying to do and what we ended up doing. So I'm not sure it is a demand characteristic. I'm not sure it's something that you could replicate necessarily on purpose. But in editing, there is a rule called edit on the moment of most action, right? So this is if you've got a scene and somebody stands up from a chair, that is a high moment of movement in that scene, right? As the person standing up from the chair. And the rule is that you cut on that moment. You edit the film on the person standing up. And that kind of editing is going to necessarily tie the editing to the events. Because think about what the definition of events I was giving to my participants, right? It was tap anytime you see a change in whatever you are paying attention to. So ultimately, that rule of editing is going to end up getting you that. So as long as the events themselves are fractal, which I would argue they're gonna be, then tying the editing to the events should end up making fractal editing. But like I said, it's not a demand characteristic. You can't sit down and do it. I've tried. So I don't know if it would make it easier or harder or make people think uncomfortably when they're trying to edit. I don't know what the effect would be.
Excellent. Okay, so you may have just answered it, but we have a question from Jonathan who asks, can I structure my slides to make my students remember more?
That is my hope. That is exactly what I would hope would be the case. Yes. So I would think that it would be about the timing. So what I do is all in timing, although it's worth noting that you can do fractals in space. So maybe the way you distribute them on the slide too, that's not my back. So this would be like the timing of the presentation. And so if you could sit down and figure out like a good Hearst for that, and then do the auto timing of the slides, but then you'd have to practice a lot to make sure that your speech matched up with the slides. So feels like it would be a little extra work, but I think you could make it happen.
Interesting. So I guess this leads me to another question then. I've heard it sometimes asked of sort of a lot of the predictive processing stuff, the Bayesian stuff, that if the brain is Bayesian, why is the math of it hard for us? Like, why can't we just do it easily? So maybe I'll ask kind of the same thing. Like, why is it not that easy to just sort of perceive, like the Hearst exponent of, a movie or something like that?
So I reject the premise of the question.
Okay.
I first of all, I think it is easy, right? As evidenced by the fact that I brought in a bunch of undergrads and they were able to mimic the added Hearst, no problem. But the other thing is that you don't have to be aware of the math to still be governed by it. So I think about the planets and the way that they orbit the sun and the way that they get affected by gravity. The math that governs those systems is complicated. Understanding relativity is complicated, but it's not like the planets are doing math, right? They themselves are not engaged in doing math to make these things happen. They're just doing what they do. The math that describes what is happening might be complicated, but what is happening is actually very simple. And I think that the same thing is happening here, right? You have what are ultimately very simple processes resulting in something where the math describing them is complicated. But you think about like other structures, other natural structures that end up creating fractals, right? The outlines of clouds or the winding of rivers or the branching of trees. Those do that because it is the most advantageous thing to do, right? So thinking about a tree growing, by having that fractal pattern, it increases the amount of space that it has to get oxygen and sunlight on its leaves. So it's going to increase the amount of nutrients that it brings into itself by growing fractally. And the tree is not doing math. It is doing a very simple process that results in a fractal. Right. So I think it's important to separate the two things, right? One is about describing a phenomenon and the other one's about engaging in the phenomenon. Engaging in these phenomena is very easy, right? Do it every day, like every day. But describing it might be more complicated.
That's really well put. I like that. So then I guess maybe I'll just kind of follow on. Why is it that things maybe like Euclidean geometry or, you speak about in the book, local or efficient causality, is it just, sort of force of culture and time that those things kind of appear intuitive to people? Or is it something to do with that gap between, like you said, engaging and describing?
Yeah, I think both. The Euclidean geometry, the Newtonian physics are a very good way to do geometry and physics. Using that frame of reference, that type of measurement is going to help you when you're trying to do physics. But we're not trying to do physics. I'm just trying to make it down my flight of stairs without falling. I'm just trying to open my refrigerator and grab a yogurt without stumbling. I'm just trying to navigate. I'm just trying to live. I'm not trying to do physics. I have to deal with the fact that there's physics. I have to deal with those things, but I'm not going to be dealing with them through physics. I'm going to be dealing with them through a organism specific reference frame. So I think when we're avoiding using those types of geometries and those types of physics, it's not because we inherently think they're wrong or bad. It's because they are wrong for this question, right? That is not the question we're asking. We're asking this question. And for this question, we have to do more organism specific work. And so it makes sense to have our own frame of reference to do that in. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure I answered the question.
No,
okay.
That was really good.
Sometimes I just get talking,
Oh, that was great. So I thought maybe we will shift gears unless I see any other questions. And maybe you could speak to us a little bit about this new textbook.
Yes. So I should give credit where credit is due. I did not write this by myself. I wrote this with my co-author, Jeff Wagman, who's brilliant, and we have such a great partnership. I love working with him. And we actually wrote we co-edited a different book, an edited volume, which we both wrote chapters in, but we had a lot of fun doing that. And then we were brainstorming because we were like, that was fun. Let's do something else. And we were brainstorming like, what does the field need? What do we need right now? And if we just kept coming back to this intro text because we don't have one and we really need one. And the number of times I've heard people say, I really need an intro text. And of course, I kept looking back also to my own experience being a grad student and just feeling like so in over my head so often. I had incredible, amazing teachers, but I still was just lost a lot. So I wanted to give like a basic version of that. And so we decided to put together an intro text. It was our COVID project, so people built decks or learned to make bread. I wrote a book. And that's what we put together. We're really proud of how it turned out. I will say that Fred, who you saw in the talk, is throughout that whole book. So if you liked little Fred here today, there's plenty of him in this book. He's the main character. Not many textbooks have a main character, but mine does. So yeah.
Can I ask if there's an inspiration for the name Fred?
No, it's the only one for which there is no inspiration. It was the first name that popped into my head. So I created him when I was at UConn, and I took the teaching class with Michael Turvey, which was a required class at the time. And his whole methodology for teaching is make everything into a cartoon, right? If you can cartoonize it, if you can draw it, if you can make it into a diagram, it'll be easier. And you'll also be able to cross boundaries when you have like a student for whom English is not their first language. Putting it into pictures is a universal language, right? And so in the process of that, I needed a person to be engaging in it. And so I created this little circle with legs because it's super easy to draw. And then he needed a name.
Okay. I was wondering because I was recognizing a lot of names in there, like Claudia.
Yes.
I was thinking, Fred, am I blanking on that?
Nope,
Okay,
he's
so
the
he's
only
a
one.
standalone.
Every single other person or place or video game or animal in the book, every other one is named after an ecological great or some ecologically related concept. But not Fred. Fred just has always been Fred.
That's great. And one thing I really appreciated about the textbook is I like how it starts by talking about axioms and different ways that you can go on some of those questions.
Yeah.
Because I think that is where a lot of the confusion comes from in some of the more traditional textbooks. They sort of start you in the middle, but they don't tell you necessarily what choices they took to get there. And then that becomes difficult when you find a different view or a different paradigm to say, well, where did it branch off or where did the difference happen?
Oh,
So
thank you.
I thought that was really inspired.
Thank you. And I'll tell you, that came from me having that moment that you're talking about of I not really being sure sort of where the deviation happened. And again, in the teaching class, having to suddenly teach where that split, like where, how do we now go over here? What are we rejecting when we reject that perspective? What foundational thing are we rejecting to make a different choice? And I also think this is true kind of in a lot of areas of science where people don't make explicit the assumptions that they are making, right? The choices that they make at the outset to just take as true.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do that, then you're going to find yourself doing, going off the rails and doing something that isn't ultimately going to work out if you make choices that you can't support.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like you pointed out in the book, one of the biggest ones was insisting on local causality. We know that is not the only causality, right? And that changes a lot to just kind of toss that out and say, well, let's instead do a different type of causality. Oh, well, then the rest of the problems fall away because we can just do it differently. Yeah.
And yeah, that's great. What type of responses have you got from this kind of approach with undergraduates?
These days I don't actually get to teach sensation and perception. Right now I'm teaching biological psychology and research methods, but I used to teach this at my previous job. And it was kind of it's cool. It's cool to teach it, right? Because you can bring them with you on that journey, right? On the historical journey, on the this is where we started with these assumptions, and here's the field that grew out of it, and here's all the research of that field. But then every time you get a little far, and then you hit a wall. And then you go a little, and then you hit a wall, and the kid, they get frustrated. They're like, but we're not answering the questions if we keep hitting that wall. And I'm like, yes, but let's start over, right? And then you can do the whole thing again, but now for ecological, and it's like all those barriers disappear, and suddenly we can start answering those questions and taking this further and asking different types of questions. So they get really excited when they get to that part, because now we're kind of getting rid of the, oh yeah, well, that's not going to work. Nope, that's not going to work, right? So you get rid of that part of that. So they enjoy it, usually, at least when I'm teaching.
That's great. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. That's fantastic. Julia, well, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this talk. I'm sure others will as well. So be sure to check out that textbook. There is a link to it on the Twitter page. So if you've not checked that out, be sure to look at it. That's a really, really big resource, as well as Julia's other published research as well.
And if you're interested in more about the film stuff, the other book that I did, the chapter I did in that book is all about this. It's all about, ecological film theory.
Yeah, that's fantastic as well. That's a really good resource.
Thanks.
All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.